Star Wars. Love it, hate it, indifferent to it? There's no denying that this is a big chunk of IP. From 1977 to insert current year here, Star Wars has been a massive part of pop culture, having some kind of foothold in some way in the social space. Now, I used to consider myself a huge, hardcore Star Wars fan, gobbling up the movies and shows and merch. However, my Star Wars trivia knowledge does take a pretty sharp dip when talking about the absolute wave of new content produced under the Disney flag. Because of that, I'll consider myself something of a casual fan. I've seen some movies, I've read some books, I built some Legos. But I think that should be enough for me to talk about these, the Star Wars role-playing game lineup from Fantasy Flight Games. Or at least, it used to be from Fantasy Flight Games. See, back when I bought my copies, they were still produced under Fantasy Flight. Since then, they've gone out of print, but have been reprinted by Edge Studios. If you've seen these books in stores from either Fantasy Flight or Edge Studios, you might notice that I am actually missing one of them, a third book called Edge of the Empire. I'll talk about why that is in a second, but first, I want to talk about my personal history with this game. See, this is actually the first role-playing game I ever played. My friends and I got together and I GM'd a few awful sessions through which we had a terrific time. My copy of Age of Rebellion is completely beat up and trashed because I've taken this game everywhere. Now, does that mean that my review of the Star Wars role-playing game system is going to be biased? Well, maybe, I don't know, but I can tell you this. It certainly isn't going to be the most positive review I've ever made. I am not going to shy away from telling you why I think these games' rules have quite a few issues and why playing through them might make for a pretty clunky campaign. So, all that said, let's get started.
Well, of course I know him. He's me.
So, the Star Wars role-playing game is exactly what it sounds like. With one of these books, the players and the GM get to tell stories through the Star Wars universe. There are 3 different books to choose from, each one focusing on a different aspect of that universe. This one, my personal favorite, Age of Rebellion, puts you in the boots of a rebel soldier fighting an uphill battle against an evil empire to try and save the galaxy. This one, Force and Destiny, puts you in the robes of a Jedi who somehow survived the Emperor's Order 66 and now has to live in the shadows. To be fair, the more I read about Jedi surviving Order 66, the more I just feel like Vader kind of did a terrible job of actually killing all the Jedi he set out to kill. Yeah, it's a big galaxy, but it's a big empire, guys. What happened? The third book, which I don't have with me, is Edge of the Empire. In this book, you play as smugglers, bounty hunters, and any other kind of criminal living in the outer rim of the Star Wars galaxy, trying to make your fortune through the less lawful enterprises. Now, no matter which book you choose, each of them will use the same game system. Star Wars RPG uses custom dice. Players, during any moment of high tension, will take pools of these dice, with some being negative and some being positive, and will roll them to see what happens next. On these custom dice are symbols for success and symbols for failure, but also other things like advantage and threat, which also play a role in the kind of story you tell. Threat symbols and advantage symbols happen regardless of whether or not your action succeeds or fails, leading to some more interesting outcomes than just straight success or straight failure. The way this works is pretty simple. For example, you may be trying to stop a chicken walker. Yes, I know it's an ATST, but chicken walker is way more memorable, from destroying some blast doors, protecting some rebels. Now, maybe you take a few shots at that chicken walker, but don't actually do any damage because you failed the roll, but roll a bunch of advantages instead. In this case, maybe you don't do any damage, but notice a critical weak point on that walker's whole, legs, whatever, that one of your fellow players can take advantage of. In an opposite example, let's say that you succeed in sneaking into some kind of Imperial hideout, but roll a bunch of threat in the process. This could mean that as you sneak into the base, you realize that the info you had on the number of stormtroopers actually in there wasn't exactly accurate, and now you are stuck in a situation where there is more of a threat around you than you previously thought. The individual symbols look a little complicated, but once you know what they are, and once you understand that positive and negative matching symbols cancel each other out, the whole dice reading system becomes a lot more easy for you to wrap your head around. Now, to encourage players to actually roleplay, the game includes things like duties and motivations for your characters that, if you follow them, will gain you critical resources later on. In addition to that, there's also the destiny mechanic, which simulates the ebb and flow of the Force in the galaxy. This allows the players to do things like upgrading their dice pools and rolling more dice, and allows the GM to do things like upgrading their own challenges and presenting new challenges to the players in a sort of push and pull tug-of-war system.
Laugh it up, fuzzball.
Now, when it comes to the books themselves, if you are a Star Wars fan, or if you just love a thick lore book with a bunch of really cool art and really cool stories, then these books have you covered. Entire chapters are dedicated to retelling the story of the galaxy far, far away. Although, fair warning, I don't think some of this stuff is actually canon now due to the lore under Disney. I don't actually know. Anyway, the art is fantastic, depicting scenes from the movies that are iconic, but also depicting new ideas and new stories to really get your mind thinking about what kind of characters you could actually create in this universe. The game is not short on content either. There are tons of supplements and adventures to enhance and augment this game. Now, granted, a lot of them aren't actually in print right now, as Edge Studios hasn't picked them up since Fantasy Flight stopped printing. But in one of the coolest examples of this that I've actually seen, a lot of this content has been preserved by the Star Wars community, a community of Star Wars RPG fans who placed as much of this backlog onto a website that allows you to freely take from it what you need. Trust me when I say that you will not be starved for content in this game. But what I'm most impressed with is the way that this game feels like Star Wars. It takes more than a truckload of content and character options to make that happen. The game just feels Star Wars-y. These dice and dice pools feel Star Wars-y. The character options and even the character sheets themselves feel Star Wars-y. If you're a GM and a Star Wars nerd, this stuff will get you so excited to invite your friends over for a session zero. Heck, even if you're not a Star Wars nerd and just like a good, crunchy RPG, the amount of character options you have available to you will definitely get you pumped to create some sort of crazy build. Trust me, you will get excited as you get everything ready to play, as your group of friends comes together and forms a party of adventurers going into the Star Wars universe. Then you'll actually start to play it.
What a piece of junk!
She'll make 0.5 past light speed.
Now, I said earlier that the rules in this game were clunky. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think there's an important distinction between a clunky game and a crunchy game. D&D 5th edition, to me, is a crunchy game. A game with a lot of rules that might take a few sessions for you to fully grasp until you feel like you're actually playing it properly. But at no point during that process do you ever feel like you are having to force the game forward. It flows naturally, even if you forget a rule here and there. Things will still work out. Each step in the learning process of a crunchy game feels like it leads one after the other. You never feel like you're lost as to what to do next. That, to me, is a crunchy game. A clunky game, which is what I think the Star Wars RPG actually falls under, is a game in which the rules trip over themselves. Now, how does this game do that? Well, let's start with these dice. For lack of a better word, these dice pools are noisy. When you roll these dice for an action, it's difficult to actually parse out what happened because of your action. Now, yes, I did say that eventually you do get pretty good at learning what the symbols are and reading them quicker, and that is true. But in the seconds you're taking to actually take matching symbols and remove them from the dice pool, and then take all the symbols that are still remaining, give them to your GM, and have your GM then decide the outcome based on the exact symbols you rolled, well, by that point you might be able to see why this game can really drag on. Compare that to a brand new player who's trying to learn D&D, or learn any RPG with a polyhedral numbered dice system, where their biggest concern is just to learn the difference between a D8 and a D10. The D10 is the diamond-shaped one, and the D8 is the more diamond-y, diamond-shaped one. It makes sense. Once you understand these symbols and get good at actually being able to interpret them better, the game does start to flow. And in sessions where there's a lot of narrative, a lot of discussion, maybe a lot of internal conflict, or maybe some political maneuvering, well, those games can be genuinely fun, and they do give this dice system a moment to shine. But this is Star Wars. Wars. Combat is kind of implied, it's kind of in the name, and so you can imagine that a lot of sessions will probably involve combat, which should be super exciting. So how does this narrative system work in a combat scenario? And this is where we get to some real problems.
I thought they smelled bad on the outside.
The rules divide themselves in half: narrative play versus structured play. Narrative play is what I just described. Players rolling dice based on the risks involved in their actions and telling the story through what they see. Standard stuff, and it allows the dice system to actually shine. During combat, however, the game switches to structured play. In other words, it slams the brakes on this narrative dice system it's so proud of, and then tries to shoehorn it into a really strange combat version of Dungeons and Dragons? Combat begins with players rolling initiative, a part of D&D that I think most players already don't like because it just slows everything down for a bit of the game. At least with D&D or other polyhedral dice systems, it doesn't last very long, a minute at most as players figure out what order they're going to go in. With this game though, there are no numbers on the dice, so how would you roll initiative? Well, it's done through another dice pool based on some of the character's skills. You look for certain symbols, and that tells you what part of initiative you actually get. But there's a problem here as well. This is a custom dice system, meaning you probably only have one set of these dice and are having to share that with your players. So you have to pass this pool of dice around the table, allowing each player to roll and find out what initiative slot they were able to score while you wait for this whole mess to be over just for the combat to begin. So after a few minutes of passing the dice around to figure out in which order the good guys and bad guys will go, you can finally start taking combat actions. On your turn, you get to do a few moves, and you get one chance to roll the dice in an action of shooting a blaster or hitting a guy with a club. The rules around whether or not you do hit that guy with a club are fairly simple. If you succeed, you hit; if you fail, you miss, and the difficulty is based on how far away you are and other scenarios in the combat. But don't forget, this is a narrative system that also includes advantages and threats. Now, could these have involved giving small bonuses to your damage output here and there, or maybe giving you an extra leg up in the next round? A very simple rule for everyone to remember? No, not at all. Instead, in the book is a chart showing the players what things they can buy with their advantages and what things the GM can buy with threats. And don't forget, this doesn't just happen once per round, this happens after every single action in the combat. Every player gets a chance to look at that chart and choose something. Now, the chart does include a narrative option saying that the GM can just throw the player some nebulous advantage on their next combat round here and there. But then, what does that mean for the amount of advantage you get? Is one advantage better than 3? And if so, as the GM, you have to account for that. The same thing goes for threats, as you buy those to use against your players. If you have a combat featuring just 5 players and 1 NPC or 1 group, a single battle in this game could last ages unless you've memorized that entire chart and know what each amount of advantage or threat does during each action that each player takes. This gets so bad that in the different campaigns of this I've run, many of them short, but one was a bit longer, I've decided that instead of running the combat encounter as written in the book, I would just keep the gameplay in narrative form, letting the players roll their actions using their skills and just kind of deciding how much damage would be dealt due to their role. But if you do that, you ignore many of the characters' skill trees that the players gave them because they sounded interesting. These abilities that come from these different classes mostly have to do with combat. And if you're skipping the structured form of combat, you're also skipping those abilities. So I was left between a rock and a hard place. I would run the combat as written in the book, only for it to take up huge chunks of our sessions, or I would run it in narrative play, which meant that a lot of the abilities that were being chosen by players weren't becoming relevant. It's a pretty big problem, and I think at the core of that problem is these custom dice. Okay, and I'm sorry, can I rant about these dice for a second? Not about how they work in the game, I've already done that. Something else entirely. What you're seeing on the table here actually isn't one set of dice, it's actually two. One came from my copy of the Age of Rebellion beginner game. Every beginner starter set comes with a copy of these dice. The other set I bought just by themselves. If I was to split them apart, through the magic of editing, I've separated them into their separate piles. Now you'll see that there are 3 green dice and 3 purple dice that come in a single set of the Star Wars RPG dice. The green dice are used by the players for using their abilities and skills. The purple dice are given to the players by the GM, and these represent challenges and complications. These dice are negative dice. They're used by the GM, and the number that a player rolls represents how complicated whatever they're trying to do actually is. Except, the core rulebook has a chart showing the difficulty of certain actions going from 1 to 5, and yet there are only 3 purple dice in a starting set. This means there's not enough dice in the beginner game or in a set you just bought from any game store to represent the full range of difficulty in the core rules. And yes, that problem is also true of other dice, which you will quickly find you need more of if you want to roll all of them at the same time. If you don't want to roll all of them at the same time, then I suppose you could just roll one over and over again, memorizing the results to turn this already clunky system into an even clunkier mess. Now, yes, Fantasy Flight did sell sets of these dice just by themselves, but if you couldn't find a beginner game in which to get some of these dice as well as some extra content, then again, you didn't have enough dice to play the full game without buying a second set. You would need 2 sets of dice, or 1 set of dice and a beginner game with dice included, to feel like you actually had enough to go around. And go around they will, because if you're buying this game, you're probably buying it to GM it. And if you're going to GM it, you're probably the only person crazy enough to buy custom dice that can only be used for one game and one game only. And when this game went out of print for a little while, at least on my end, I found these dice actually became kind of scarce, leading to inflated prices online. Don't worry though, because with the reprinting by Edge Studios also comes the remaking of these dice packs. Did Edge Studios add more dice to the pack so you had enough to actually play with? No, they did not. Alright, look, there are solutions to this. There is a Star Wars RPG dice app that allows you to roll an unlimited number of these dice. There is also the abysmal dice chart in the book itself, if you're feeling really crazy, which helps you to translate regular polyhedral numbered dice into these kinds of dice if you want to take every action to look at, once again, another chart. But here's the thing. The second you start using these charts and apps, that's the second that the game starts to not feel as Star Warsy as it used to. I mentioned that was a big reason why I actually really like these books. And if you don't have that Star Warsy feel, well, what you're left with isn't much.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough.
Okay, so should you actually buy these books? Am I recommending that you play the very first RPG that I ever had a chance to play? Well, let's go through each book one by one. First, the easy one, the one that I don't have here with me, Edge of the Empire. Do I recommend that you play Edge of the Empire? No, because space bounty hunting and space criminal enterprises and seedy underbelly corporations has already been done, and been done very well in this game. If you want to play as the scum and villainy in Star Wars, may I recommend to you scum, and villainy. This is a Forged in the Dark RPG, with all those elements I just mentioned, but using a well-known and well-respected game system, the same one used in the RPG Blades in the Dark. And if you want to play in the Star Wars universe specifically, well then I think just a little bit of homebrewing should be enough to get you there. Okay, enough about that. What about these other two? Again, I can't deny that they look the part. They dress the part, which is such a hard thing to really nail down, and I have to respect them for that. Honestly, just reading through these as lore books is exciting for me, so I'm kind of the target demographic. And maybe that's the real question. Are you a nerd enough that these rules won't stop you from having a good time in the game? Maybe you're just going to homebrew your own combat rules and focus on player fun as opposed to the mechanics of the actual game. If that's you and you're a Star Wars nerd, I think you can have an awesome time with these books. Otherwise, there are plenty of other smaller titles out there, ones that don't have the added cost of a bunch of extra custom dice for you to get started actually playing. Things made that will get you into that sort of gameplay quicker and easier than these books will. Those books may be a better fit for your table. If you like the Star Wars franchise and really want to run a game within that universe using mechanics that, while extremely clunky, feel Star Warsy, then yeah, I suppose these books might work for you. I guess it's up to you to decide. For me, I've loved having these books in my collection, and while I probably won't run a game with them in the future, I can say I have some pretty fond memories of the absolutely terrible campaigns I have run within the Star Wars universe. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been The RiDE. I'll see you next time.